Okay, so I'm Karin Beland Lindahl. I'm the project leader of this project, and you can see the title now in Swedish. Our partners are primarily universities in Canada and some mining and indigenous companies in Canada. So the aim of this project is to develop better tools to better handle land use conflicts between indigenous communities, mining industry, and the state. And our point of departure is that the state has an important role in actually setting the play field for the other actors. We're approaching this task by comparing 5 cases, 2 in Sweden and 3 in Canada. Why Canada? Well, because we're interested primarily in the role of indigenous rights to this relationship between the mining industry and indigenous communities. And here we believe that we have a lot, or we may have a lot to learn from Canada. It's kind of at the front edge of these issues. So our questions are, we're interested in exploring the interaction and the quality of the interaction between companies, indigenous communities, and the state. And we're particularly interested in exploring the role of indigenous rights and the regulatory framework for actually determining the quality of the relationship and the interaction between mining industry and indigenous communities. So obviously this project contributes to the objectives about social acceptance and social license to operate that exist within STRIM. Eventually we're interested in understanding the role of interaction, quality of interaction for outcomes, that is access, resistance, or acceptance. So this project has different steps. The first step is a kind of problem inventory that primarily focused actually on the Swedish actors. So what questions do the Swedish state, company, and industry want to feed in to the case studies that we're doing in Sweden and Canada? This phase is finished, and we have some, I think, interesting results. And what was particularly interesting is that actually, although the Swedish actors do not agree about everything and sometimes really are in conflict, there was a pretty broad agreement actually on the nature of this problem. So most of the actors came up with very similar questions that they wanted to have explored. And this indicates that there is a kind of common idea actually of what kind of problems that exist with the Swedish regulatory framework. And everybody agreed there are problems. So most of the questions were posed to the state, even from the state actors. Many questions about rights, indigenous rights, and regulations. Basically, how does the state interpret indigenous right? And from the Sami reindeer herding community's point of view, what does the state want with reindeer husbandry, with Sami culture? There were many questions to the Sami reindeer herding community. Industry and the state want more knowledge. The Sami reindeer herding communities also ask whose knowledge is going to count, and in what situations, and who's going to pay for actually enabling or delivering this knowledge. Many questions about values and prioritizations, how value different interests in relation to each other. What does acceptance actually mean? When is something accepted? Of course, everybody was interested in consultation and collaboration, best practice. There were also interesting questions coming up that we've taken on board, which are important to acknowledge in terms of the contextual differences between Canada and Sweden. So, for instance, geography, what does that mean? Or a different kind of land use. First Nations do not necessarily practice reindeer husbandry, and generally socioeconomic factors. I mean, in Sweden we have a more developed welfare state. So these questions have now been fed into the next step, which is qualitative case studies, which we do in Canada and Sweden. And our 2 Swedish cases, that's Aitik, and it's Galok or Kalak. And we're in the middle of this research of the case studies, but I think that I can say a few things about where we're heading and what they've shown so far. So what's maybe interesting in the Swedish cases are that there actually it's the same regulatory framework that are regulating both two cases, still very different outcomes. One is a very high-level conflict, one there's been ongoing collaboration for years and years. In terms of the regulatory framework, the issues that have come up is that there are unclarities with the Swedish regulations and also sometimes weakly coordinated authorities. What we can also see when we compare this with the Canadian situation is that Sami rights, to the extent that they exist in the Swedish constitution and in the regulations, they do not really tie into the mining legislation. So when it comes to mining and mine establishment, Sami reindeer herding communities are still treated in a way as a kind of public interest, a specific kind of public interest. This is something very different in Canada, where they have that their status as a indigenous people is much more clear. So some of the reasons that actually influence then the differences that we can see between these cases appear to relate to the Sami reindeer herding communities that have different access to different kind of resources in the two cases. They have a different position in the local community in these two cases, and the companies in the two cases have also applied different strategies. The quality of the relationships, we're analyzing that right now. We can see that they're quite different than in the conflict case Kalok than in the Aitik case. Nevertheless, the same issues about uneven power relations and lack of influence come up in the two cases. Clearly, one of the cases there is a conflict. In the other, we can say it's acceptance. But we're kind of probing what does that actually mean. Does this mean everybody's happy, or is this? I mean, from the Sami reindeer herding communities, they're more actually framing this in terms of a forced acceptance, because did they ever have a choice rather than to accept? If we move to Canada, we can see that there are different regulatory frameworks that actually are in play in the different cases, because they're different provincial legislation. However, what's different in all the Canadian cases compared with the Swedish is that there exists a duty to consult. Okay, that's a federal duty, and it's a duty to consult. That's actually, it's the state's duty to make sure proper consultations with the indigenous nations. And they also have stronger constitutional rights. So in this sense, the First Nations have a clearly privileged position, a specific position. They're not treated as any other kind of public interest, but there are negotiations between nation to nation, and that's set sort of a completely different stage here. But then we have different provincial legislations. The quality of the relationships here, we can see that they differ also here. In one case, the BC case, there is a conflict. The First Nations do not want to have this mine established. The relationship are really bad, approximately as in the Kalok case. However, that's sort of now, they also got a no, and they're now moving ahead. In the other cases, the relationships are very well developed, and they're more framed in terms of equal partnerships, which both parties appear to be quite happy with. So this is just a little sort of taste of the case studies that we're currently analyzing. So basically where we are now is to step 2, finalize the data collection for the case studies. We're then going to compile these data more systematically and to compare it more systematically, and also to produce our deliverables, a popular brief, a collection of best practice and policy recommendations, and that's something we're going to do during January to March. The next big thing that we're planning now are learning innovation workshops, because we do not believe that you can just copy-paste stuff in Sweden. So we'll learn from all the cases, and in June, hopefully first week of June, we will have a Canadian delegation coming over here And then there will be opportunities for the First Nations to discuss community to community, what's actually useful in a Swedish context. And the same thing with industry, industry to discuss, well, is there anything of what we have learned from these case studies that actually can be applied in the Swedish or in the Canadian context? We also hope to be able to plan a meeting with decision makers in Stockholm, because we are, I guess, as you can see here, one very important sort of avnämare, stakeholder, or basically maybe the receiver of the results here is the state and the Swedish state. But we're also planning for a final seminar in Luleå this first week of June, and anybody who's then interested in learning more about this project is very welcome.